Welcome to OBGYNs for a Sustainable Future. I'm really excited to interview Matt Simon. Matt is a reporter at Grist. I'm a supporter of Grist. I think their reporting is some of the best in the nation, maybe even the world, on climate, on plastics, on environmental contaminants and toxicants. And so I encourage all my listeners today, if you can, to become a subscriber. And Matt has written a book that I think is also really important called Microplastics, a Poison Like No Other. I personally learned a lot from it. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to Matt today was because we've been recently seeing a lot of articles coming out about the health harms of microplastics. And Matt, you know, I am a OBGYN, so I am sort of at that inflection point in human health when environmental toxicants are affecting the lives of two people at once, the pregnant woman and her unborn fetus. And what we're learning is obviously that there are a lot of environmental exposures that can have profound and lasting effects on the next generation. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'll get right into my questions. I am a member of some large women physician groups, 30, 40,000 members. And we talk. And just today, actually, there was a discussion about whether or not buying organic food would be something that we would recommend to our family members, but also to our patients, especially given the recent data about PFAS, which of course is a endocrine disruptor, specifically because of data coming out showing that 14% of all conventional ingredients in pesticides are made from PFAS. And the EPA has been shown to not be studying whether or not the PFAS in pesticides is having an effect on the nature by which those chemicals are implicating or affecting our health, the way in which these chemicals become cumulative in our bodies and transform in the pesticide over time. And so I'm curious, Matt, if a family member were to ask you, would you say that buying organic is better for any number of reasons?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take it from the plastics side of things that the reason I'm here, obviously. So I will say that when it comes to exposure to the many different chemicals that have been used in plastics. So when I wrote the book, I had cited a study that actually went back and kind of reverse engineered a lot of these plastics because these plastic companies aren't telling us what is in these products. I was like, there's no ingredient list on a plastic bottle. So engineers are reverse engineering them, finding in this study at least 10,500 different chemicals that have been used in plastic, a quarter of which scientists consider to be of concern. So that means they're either known to be toxic or they are biopersistent. They last a long time in the environment. It's just impossible to get them out of there once they're in the environment. That study was actually revised after I published the book recently. They have bumped that number up to 13,000 different chemicals. I
Oh,
would not be
wow.
surprised if they found more. So when I'm considering the food that I eat, obviously you don't want it sprayed with these pesticides that we also know to be highly toxic to human beings. But we also have to consider here the way that that food got to your plate. So if you go to Trader Joe's, you just see wall-to-wall plastic packaging,
Right,
little bits of broccoli packaged in in plastic. Cucumbers, one of the most infuriating images
right.
that I've
Yeah,
ever seen. I included in my presentation single-use plastic wrapped cucumbers,
yeah.
which have their own skins, obviously. So why are we doing this? It is because it was always about the bottom line for these food and beverage companies, which is wrap everything in plastic, reduces cost, reduces the weight of the packaging, allows them to ship it for cheaper. So we are finding obviously a tremendous amount of microplastic in foods that are packaged in plastic. one of the major things that breaks apart plastic, it's this very tough material by design, is freezing and heating. So when you're freezing stuff in a plastic bag in your freezer, that is breaking apart microplastics, but also leaching a lot of these chemicals into those foods. So if it's organic broccoli or whatever it is packaged in plastic, maybe it doesn't have the pesticides, but it has maybe several of the 13,000 different chemicals that have been used in plastic that we know to be toxic. Do not, under any circumstances, ever heat food in plastic. It is an extraordinarily poisonous thing to do to food. Not just the microplastics breaking off of that, but the chemicals leaching out into it. So that's my spiel about food, is that we've gotten too used to the industry saying everything can be wrapped in plastic and we should be eating off of that. When honestly, for 10,000 years of human civilization, we got along perfectly fine with wrapping things in plastic. We need to go back to that mentality, which is not everything needs to be fully wrapped in plastic that we know to be very toxic.
Yeah, and so I'm curious because I had a question specifically about that study that came out showing the known harmful chemicals in food packaging 10 days ago. So why do you think that plastic packaging around food has somehow gotten a pass, in the sense that it's almost like nobody's minding the store, and obviously companies, get revenue when they wrap individual vegetables in plastic. Do you have an idea as to why that aspect of plastic packaging and food has only recently, say, come to light with maybe even just that recent study?
I think the the line all along with these plastics companies was not only is plastic safe, it actually makes our food safer, right? So
Right.
if we're
Okay. Yeah.
able to plastic wrap things, they last longer. You have fewer foodborne illnesses. But all along, nobody was testing the component chemicals because, again, these plastic companies were not telling us what was in a plastic bottle or a plastic bag. So it was up to engineers to reverse engineer it. I think I hear a lot from people who want to keep using plastics that this is what the consumer wanted, right? So
Oh, yes. Yeah. I've
the
heard that
demand
mantra.
is there.
Consumer
Yeah, so the
demand.
demand is there. Like we want everything wrapped in plastic. I don't know anybody who was
Right.
explicitly saying that they wanted everything to be
I'm like,
wrapped in
where are these
single-use
focus
plastic.
groups?
Yeah, right, exactly. But I think this is one of the things that actually gives me hope. Even though plastics production is on track to triple by the year 2050, we're already producing 1 trillion pounds of plastic a year. That would be 3 trillion pounds by that time, which is just mind-blowing. One of the things that gives me hope is that there is a greater awareness now of the harms of plastic. So you had mentioned the human health studies that are coming out. When I was writing the book, those were very rare still. So at that time, there had been a good number of studies that had found where in the environment microplastics and nanoplastics are. Nanoplastics, by the way, are these even more harmful things that are smaller than a millionth of a meter. I don't know why I made that size. They're much smaller than this, but they're so tiny that they're imperceptible to humans. So scientists have done a really good job of finding where in the environment that is. Now we're getting more studies about where they are in the human body. They have been found basically everywhere. Scientists have
Right.
looked. The next frontier is, okay, well, what does that mean? What are the consequences? How do we tease apart the contribution of microplastics and nanoplastics to human health problems versus any number of other exposures to chemicals that we have in our day-to-day lives? Those studies will come out 5 years, hopefully, maybe 10. We'll get
Yeah.
much more clarity on that.
Yeah, well, a study came out this year that actually had a lot of impact for us as OBGYNs, and that was Trissan's study about the fact that, based on their data, they attributed 1 in 10 preterm births to exposure to phthalates. Um, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work. Uh, he just did actually a 2-day symposium at NYU last week during climate work. Did you happen to go to that?
So you broke up there. I missed the last 5 seconds.
Oh, I said, did you happen to attend Leonardo Tressan's 2-day symposium at NYU last week on microplastics and human health?
No, I did not. No.
Oh, okay. Um, Well, he had a lot of researchers there, and obviously they were presenting a lot of this human health data. Um, I'm curious, Trissan's background is as a pediatrician, but obviously he has done a lot of work, collaborated with others, looking at human health studies, whether cardiovascular disease or fertility, or the maternal fetal period of time. And I'm curious if you, in all of your reporting or in your research, one thing that some of my patients and colleagues ask me is, if plastics were so harmful, why would we be feeding our babies infant formula in plastic bottles? Do you have an idea why that has allowed, to persist, or why there hasn't been a consumer backlash about that specific mode of exposure to just to infants?
I think it was to no fault of consumers. It was an ignorance thing. I mean, that study that you're talking about, the plastic bottles, that came out maybe 3, 4 years ago, I want to say. So they uh, to explain to viewers about how this works. So they went prepared formula in a plastic bottle like a parent typically would, and found that because of that, again, the heat that breaks apart plastics pretty readily, causes somewhere on the order of a couple of millions of microplastics to break off, to expose to an infant each day. And they hadn't looked at nanoplastics. So this is a very important thing that I always try to get across to people, is that when you hear that, okay, 1 million microplastics are getting into an infant by way of its formula every day, that is a massive underestimate, and
Right.
necessarily so. So scientists can only look down to a certain size. It remains very difficult and very expensive to find the nanoplastics. But when you have 1 million microplastics going into an infant, it's probably more on the order of trillions of nanoplastics. And these are the ones that are so small that they not only get into the body, they can get into individual cells within a body, and can likely pass the blood-brain barrier, because a recent study did find and
Mhm.
confirmed that microplastics and nanoplastics are in the brain. So it was always like we were, again, always told that plastics are not only perfectly safe, but they make everything else around them safer, right? So parents need to be using glass wherever possible, but this comes down to an equity issue too, right? So like,
Right.
not everybody can afford the most expensive baby supplies made out of glass. So we need visibility not only to the harms of plastics, but ways that we can get people off of them, that are equitable and actually cheap for everybody across the board.
Yeah. Anytime, anytime we're talking about plastics, there necessarily is an equity issue, whether it's exposure to EDCs through personal care products that are marketed to Black and Brown women, um, the plastics manufacturing, and who lives in vicinity of that and therefore has a 10-year less, or whatever that figure is, life expectancy. Um, but yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that forward, because equity is a through line through all of this discussion. Um, so one of the things that I feel like I didn't have a clear takeaway after reading your book was about the effects of plastics crossing the skin barrier. So you pointed out 2/3 of all clothing now has plastics in it, or is 100% plastics. Doctors are always wearing those jackets made by Patagonia or knockoffs, so we are always, always, always dressed in plastic at the hospital. But I'm curious, we know from scientific studies that plastics clothing can cross the skin barrier, but do you have an idea, and could you share whether or not you think that's a significant source of microplastics in the body, clothing, that is?
In conversations that I had with scientists for the book, I mean, there weren't really good studies on this, but they had always assumed that it's probably going to be minor compared to the other routes of exposure. But they also weren't really considering nanoplastics as much. When I was trying to, really, you've just been hearing the past couple of years, nanoplastics, 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 because they are so much more worrisome than microplastics given their size. I think nanoplastics probably can pass through the skin, but also the component chemicals of the plastic in our clothing. 2/3 of clothing is now made out of plastic, polyester, nylon, these sorts of things. So the researchers had said, yeah, I mean, it's feasible, possible, but what we should really worry about is, I think, inhalation.
Inhalation. Okay.
So yeah, so one scientist, again, let's caveat this heavily, calculate that we inhale something like 7,000 microplastics a day, down to a certain size. So it is probably many, many, many more nanoplastics that we're inhaling. Also, what's coming through our food, infants getting dosed with millions of microplastics a day in their formula, just because parents aren't aware of this issue. So skin, I think, is possible for sure, but I would worry more about, okay, we're walking around in all of this plastic. By one researcher's calculation, we shed 1 billion fibers from our clothing a year.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
either go directly into our mouths and our noses, or they settle on the floor, which is another consideration for infants crawling
Yeah.
around. Millions of these particles settling on the floor of a typical living room each day. Kids playing around and they're kicking them up into the air. Dogs, cats doing the same thing. So I tell people whatever they can do, just vacuum religiously, but also be careful about how you dispose of that dust, that you're not just making it fly up into the air anyway.
Exactly.
So yeah, we should consider, unfortunately, every route that these particles have into our bodies. But I'd be more concerned about inhalation, just because that gets into the lungs and stays there. But nanoplastics probably go through the skin.
Yeah. Okay. That's really helpful. Um, now I read your book once through. I didn't read it twice through, but I'm curious. I took away from your book that the majority of the plastics in the environment, maybe not inside the house, but in the environment, were from tires, car tires. Is that the correct takeaway?
This is the tricky thing, is that the calculation is all over the place. Some people say that car tires maybe represents a majority of the microplastic in the ocean. So this is it's a little bit of explainer. So car tires are no longer made out of natural rubber exclusively, because we just don't have enough rubber trees on the planet. They're made out of synthetic rubber. It's a plastic. So the little tiny pieces of car tire that break off are considered microplastics. They flush into gutters and then eventually into bodies of water, like rivers, lakes, and the ocean. Some people actually calculate that in the oceans, paint microplastics are the most numerous. So
Oh, wow.
any like, think about everything in the world that is painted with what is a liquid that is now
Yeah.
part plastic. So it's
Yeah.
it's not like, it's not the paint that the Romans were using, right? So
Right.
like, think about where I'm in San Francisco. We have the Golden Gate Bridge, which famously needs to be repainted constantly because of the weather here. Those little bits of paint are flaking off, falling into the ocean. Boats now. So there was one study that found that they make skid marks of microplastics as they go along the ocean. The paint coming off of them. You
Wow.
can actually track that. So yeah, it's microplastics from tires are a huge issue. We need things like better catchment systems, like rain gardens are really popular and very powerful tool for just climate mitigation in cities, regardless of, like, they reduce flooding, they're good for mental health for people. They also catch a lot of these tire particles. Yeah, it's these sneaky ways that plastics have infiltrated our lives that people don't know. I didn't know that paint was made out of plastic until I started writing the book. I'm not a very handy person, is, I think, part of the issue. Uh, Clothing, tires, cigarette butts are basically the number one found piece of plastic in plastic cleanup walks along beaches. It's not bottles and bags. It is little microfiber cigarette filters. So it's these so many ways that plastics are in our lives that people don't realize, which is going to be difficult to fix this problem. Is like we've got to replace all these things with better materials that are not highly toxic, both to humans and to ecosystems and biological organisms out there.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious. I am a newbie or nascent on this journey of understanding. And when I came across this idea that uh, for instance, when something says it's BPA free, that actually it might be replaced with a phenol that is equivalent or potentially even more toxic, BPS or BPF. Um, the public doesn't know this, and so this seems like a very um, a well executed lie, if you will. And I'm curious, when you first came across that, what was your reaction, and what have you learned about these unfortunate replacements since?
Yeah. Yeah, some people call them regrettable substitutions. This is BPA being the most famous one, right? So that got a lot of bad press, and politicians, great that they reacted and banned it. So that's why you see BPA free on a water bottle. But as you say, plastics companies are turning around, finding chemicals that are almost identical, but they're not BPA. There's some variation on it that may be just as toxic, if not more toxic, to humans. So we also need to come back to this figure of 13,000 different chemicals have been used in plastic. BPA is one of so many that we know to be toxic. Replacing one, I guess that's good for bringing visibility to the issue. But at the end of the day, everything about plastics is toxic. They're made from 99% of them are made from fossil fuels still. It's a toxic process to bring those out of the ground, toxic to turn them into plastics that are poisoning these communities. And then when we're using these plastics, they're poisoning us as well. There is no safe plastic. There never will be. These are made out of petrochemicals. So like when you hear about bioplastics, it's like,
Right, right,
oh,
right. Yeah.
that sounds nice. It's made out of flowers or something. No, it's the only thing that's biological about it is the carbon instead of coming from fossil fuels has come from plants that we have grown. The rest of the chemicals are in there. It's the same plastic with a different source of carbon. The only way out of this mess to make these materials non-toxic is to move away from plastic. We need new materials that maybe have some of plastic's properties, that
Right.
we have to be very careful that we thoroughly test. Like we don't want to replace, I don't know, some people are working with mushrooms,
Oh
to
yeah.
create like cardboard like stuff that's good for packaging. I don't think that's necessarily toxic, but when we're developing these sorts of things, we want to do the test that we never did with plastics before putting them into the marketplace. We're now
Yeah.
cleaning up this giant mess that the industry has made. We can't let this regrettable substitution happen, not just for the individual chemicals, BPA or whatever we're talking about, but we don't want a new material that just ends up being awful in different ways or even the same ways.
Yeah, exactly. What so this next question, I've heard both ways. I've heard that there is a movement afoot, to your point, to potentially ban chemicals as a class, and I really feel like the PFAS or the forever chemicals have brought this argument forward, because as you might want to share with our listeners, currently in order for the EPA to ban a chemical, it has to ban each individual chemical. So of the 13 or 14,000 that you mentioned, they would have to pass a law against each individual one. Am I right? And that some people want there to be a ban on a whole class of chemicals, but that would, and then other people say, well, that will never happen.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that. I mean, I guess BPA was banned in and of itself. That wasn't a class of chemicals. I mean, it's going to vary country to country. This is the issue. Both with regulating the chemicals that are in the plastics, but also reducing the production of plastic. So this is actually why the UN treaty under negotiations right now is so important. So it's a plastic treaty. That scientists are really hoping comes with some sort of international cap on the production of plastic. We can't let production triple in the next 2, 3 decades. So they're also saying, um, Well, actually, before I get to that, the reason there is that you don't want to ban it in one country and then the industry just picks up and goes to another country and increases production there. We need, like, internationally, we need a cap on the production, and we need all these signatories. These scientists are also saying we need to address the constituent chemicals. There's a sort of an editorial that a group of scientists put out before the first round of negotiations, saying regulate the chemicals in addition to the plastics, these chemicals that we know to
Right.
be
Yeah.
highly
Yeah.
toxic. And plastics groups that are anti-plastics groups that are in these negotiations are saying the same. We have a growing understanding that these chemicals are extraordinarily toxic. They are infiltrating the bodies of newborns before they're actually even born. So the first species of newborns has been found to have microplastics in it. They're in placentas as well. uh, we need like an emergency stop on this, not just on the production, which we know is actually effective in reducing the amount of microplastics in the environment. There's a study that found that in the 2008 financial crisis, the ocean samples were turning up less microplastic. And that was because during that financial crisis, plastics production in general declined. That's the great hope here, is that we know that this works. So if you get a UN plastics treaty that has just a hard cap on the amount of plastic that we can produce, that turns into an immediate benefit to the environment. And in your own personal life, you have an immediate benefit if you remove as much plastic as possible, both from your foods, but also clothing, carpets, things like that. But again, very difficult. Like vinyl floors. So like if you're rich, you can put in really nice oak or whatever the natural wood that they make floors out of these days. That's going to be quite pricey. The rest of us have to do vinyl flooring, which is made out of plastic or laminate or whatever. So it's, again, this equity thing is that it's going to be much easier for the rich to extract plastic from their lives with just more expensive products. I think of the most expensive products aren't wrapped in plastic because it's cheap, crummy material dropped in glass or what have
Yeah.
you. We need this cap desperately internationally, but we also need a better understanding among the public, which is part of the reason why I wrote the book, that this is a highly toxic material that we want nowhere in our lives. We don't need to recycle more. We just need to stop producing so much.
Yeah. With only a couple minutes left, my last question, I'm a doctor and I'm not one for conspiracy theories. Having said that, when I was at the National Academy of Medicine's webinar a month or so ago, this was their first webinar talking about the human health effects of microplastics. And, there were over 100 people listening. And the very first presenter was from Dow Chemical. He had been at the EPA and then he went to industry. And I'll be honest with you, the chat got lit really fast. But in researching, Dow is the number one manufacturer of plastic packaging, and that industry for them is 23 billion a year, I think. And then they also have a partnership with Saudi Aramco, and they created a separate company, Sapna or Sana or something like that. And I'm just curious, it makes me think that, given that I've seen reports anywhere from 6% up to even 12% of all global oil going into the manufacturing of plastic. And as you pointed out at the top of the interview, left unabated, those numbers of plastic production are expected to triple. Is it your opinion that, given how much we've learned about how much fossil fuels knew about the fact that we would hit this climate change tipping point, and that we would necessarily, as a society, as a humanity, need to decarbonize, do you think that there was an effort to sort of have a society addicted to plastic so that they would continue to have a revenue stream when we hit that moment of having to decarbonize?
Yeah, I mean, we can say for sure that NPR did a story, I think, a couple of years ago, where they talked to a former executive in the plastics industry who said that all along we knew that recycling didn't work. It was something that they pushed on the public as a way to deflect blame. So it is our fault as consumers that plastic pollution has gotten so out of control because we just aren't recycling enough, when in fact,
No, yeah.
currently 5% of plastics are recycled in the United States each year. It's a dismal failure because we turned it into a for-profit system that's very hard to profit from. Plastics, by their nature, are extraordinarily cheap because they're made out of cheap fossil fuels. It's hard to make that a profitable venture. In a place like Germany, they recycle about half of their plastics just because they have a much more robust system. But all along, the industry knew that it didn't work, and it allowed them to keep producing as much plastic as they want, so long as it was us as consumers that were at fault for plastic pollution. And then looking forward, the industry has also not made it a secret that as society burns fewer fossil fuels going to the future, as we're shifting to green energy, they want to produce more plastic. That is why it's going to triple in the next couple of decades, because that's their revenue stream. We're going to be switching to solar panels and wind turbines, and just burning fewer fossil fuels in the future. So they see plastics as a way to turn those fossil fuels into packaging instead. These are like these oil companies and plastic companies. It's the same. It's like they're not distinct
Right.
industries. So
Exactly.
yeah. So this is, I mean, this is why I'm hopeful that a UN treaty is going to put that cap in place, but also hopeful that the public opinion has turned here, that we had been bamboozled by this industry into thinking that this is a very safe product that is perfectly recyclable. So long as we made the effort to throw it in the right bin, all along there was very little of that being recycled. So at an inflection point here, I think we're going to have that turning in public opinion at the same time that we have these new technologies, the new materials that will help us move away from plastic, which again is impossible to make non-toxic because of all the chemicals that make a plastic are very toxic. So that's why it's not a very hopeful book. I will say you probably realize that because the stuff is absolutely everywhere in the body and in the environment. But I think something is turning right now. The public is again, to no fault of its own, it was kept in the dark about these toxicity issues, and of course the environmental issues of plastics piling up in the environment. Now that we know that the microplastics are in the atmosphere and they're falling out on every remote corner of the planet, I think that kind of image helps the public come to terms with this. But then just again, like it's so important, returning to this equity aspect, that we need to provide people with tools to switch away from this material if they don't have the means, because we can't let the low income communities get left behind once again, having to buy more of their food in plastic wraps, like at a corner store, because they don't have a proper market within distance like you do in richer neighborhoods. So that this will be waged on a number of fronts, but I don't think plastics production will triple by 2050 like the projections say. I think we're turning a corner here, and finally pushing back against the industry.
Oh, great. So what are you working on? What are your next steps?
Yeah, what are my next steps? I'm taking a break because that book, I made the mistake of writing that during the pandemic, which was a silly thing to do. I didn't need anything else to be sad about the state of the world, but I had a lot of time on my hand. I figured nobody had written the book yet, so I might as well. I want to write something hopeful next. I don't know. Maybe about puppies and kitties or something. I don't know. If anybody has any ideas, let me know. It's not going to be about plastics, I don't think.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit just for our viewers to kind of close the loop. So we at OBGYNs for a Sustainable Future, we're sort of an interest group of healthcare without harm. As you might know, they're an international organization, a signature on the Global Plastics Treaty. There was some frisson about whether or not healthcare should get an exemption from the treaty. Obviously, we signed a petition saying absolutely not. Healthcare produces, I think, is the number one consumer of single-use plastic in the US, and we produce as an industry more plastic waste than the entire country of the UK is what I've read. So myself and Ali Melnick, she's a urogynecologist. We do research on how to decarbonize our operating rooms. how to get away from single-use plastic in our area of the world in OBGYN. And then we also partner with medical students for a sustainable future. They're a separate organization, but they, we get students that are very interested in becoming part of the movement or contributing as well. So we're pushing, we're trying to get our colleagues to be better informed about how to take an environmental history, but also, for instance, getting rid of single-use plastic speculums for gynecological exams and things like that. So anyway, that's why we were interested in this topic and why we interviewed you today. And we really want to thank you for your time.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, and best of luck in your endeavors. That sounds great.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
Okay, bye.